The town of Fenter holds tales of a vicious beast that lies dormant in the woods. Hasn't been active in a good long while. Last time anyone's had a run-in with it reportedly was in 2013, but nobody's ever gone to the news about it, so there's only small-town whispers and a couple of posts online. Well, I suppose it's a perfect spot to get my first story, then. Urunta. I expected a place with a monster in their backyard to be a lot more dreary, but I guess if it's been inactive since 2013, maybe they have nothing to be upset about. Maybe I can capture this sleeping beast pretty easily then. Hey, boy. What are you doing? Nobody goes into those woods once it gets dark outside, especially in the winter. Damn city kids thinking that those woods are something to be trifled with. I'm sorry, I didn't realize this town had a curfew. I'm sorry, sir. What, are you meeting someone here, or are you just sticking your nose where it doesn't belong? I ain't never seen you around town before. What do you want in these woods? Oh, I'm a journalist. Yeah, I read a story online that I wanted to put into my tabloid, so I was following up on a few things. Don't worry, I'll be out of the town's hair soon. Heard a few stories online, huh? Figures a few of those kids would have blabbed about it to the internet. Listen, some girl went missing out there years ago, nothing you should be concerning yourself with now. Besides, what do you hope to find out there? Hoping to interview the kidnappers or something? Please, sir. I'm just looking for some answers. This paper is super important. Ugh, damn journalists. You guys are leeches, the whole lot of you. But fine. You want to poke your nose around in something you got no business poking your nose in, check the local pub. All the college kids are back on their break, and they're all drinking at the local pub tonight. Some class get-together or something. One of the boys in our town came face to face with whatever was in our woods. You want a story? Talk to him. Just stay out of those woods. Don't you make me tell you again. Thank you so much. I'll be moving along now. That ended up going actually a lot more smoothly than I would have thought. I mean, to be honest, I had no real game plan. If this guy in the pub has a story, well then I guess I am in luck. Jeez, dude. That's your 5th shot for the night. You'd best slow down. We don't need you recounting tales of monsters in the woods again. Yeah, don't worry. I won't. Jeez. You guys never let me live that down. There's my guy. Excuse me. What's this that I hear about? Monsters? What do you want to trace, friends? Just drop it, dude. If you don't believe, it's whatever. I don't know any trays. I'm just passing through town. I'm a cryptozoologist, so that's actually why I came to this town. To learn about any info that you would have would be greatly appreciated. Really? Fine, whatever. If you start laughing or making fun, I'm out of here. I wouldn't dream of it. I used to live in a small town called Fenter. It was a quiet place to grow up, with one school, a doctor's, a police station, a cinema, which films only showed a month after the national release date, 2 restaurants, and a host of local shops on the west side. Over on the east side of Fenter, there was the residential area with about 40 houses, the town bar, and the local woods, which were about 20 square miles across. Even though I'd grown up there my whole life playing in those woods, it was still easy to get lost in them. So my father used to tell me and my friends to never go past the creek that ran through about a mile or so in. Still, I mean, and this gave us plenty of space to play in, and we spent many summers building tree forts and playing hide and seek amongst the tall trees. One late summer evening, me and my friend, Jess, or out near the creek, seeing how close we could sneak up on the rabbits that inhabited the woods before they'd notice and run away. I'd spend about 10 minutes searching for one, and in my eagerness, I left Jess behind. She stopped to examine some odd shape in the rocks, and being impatient, I told her to catch up when she was finished. I was just reaching the hill where the creek bent and curved around to travel off north for another 3 miles, when I spied one chewing on some leaves near an oak tree. I held my breath, grabbed my jacket to stop it flapping in the breeze, and began to slowly inching my way towards it. I was careful to avoid stepping on any twigs. If even one snapped underfoot, it was a definite game over, and with the sun going down, this would probably be the last chance I got to play before I had to go back home for dinner. The rabbit was blissfully unaware of my presence, its brown coat tinged orange by the setting sun, ears flopped down like a hunter's hat. The irony didn't escape me as I crept up on it, silent as the leaves were floating in the breeze. I smirked. I was about 4 meters away from it now, and it still hadn't noticed me. Not my best, but it definitely wasn't bad. I slowed down my pace even more. I didn't want to make a rookie mistake in my excitement and ruin this opportunity. The rabbit finished on its leaf, and it casually began sniffing the next one before digging in. 2 meters away now, the closest that I've ever gotten. I felt my heartbeat in my chest, and for a second, I was scared that the rabbit would hear it thudding against my rib cage and dart off. I shook my head and continued up behind it. It was almost within arm's reach. I couldn't believe it. I stretched out my arm, fingers extended. Wait till Jess heard about this. I'd be the first kid in town to have touched a forest rabbit. My hand was about a foot from brushing its soft pelt now. I could see each individual hair on its back. 30 centimeters. I'd done it! I'd done it! Suddenly, an ear-splitting scream pierced the air, shaking the silence of the woods into shock, and causing the resting birds to panic and scatter from the trees. I gasped, and quick as a flash, the rabbit was under the bush and gone forever. I cursed aloud and spat, frustration clouding my head. It was a good few seconds before I even stopped to think where the scream had come from. And then, like falling from a tree, it hit me. Jess! I sprinted back up the creek as fast as I could. She'd been about 200 yards back when I'd last seen her, near the old silver birches. It took me about 2 minutes to reach the spot, next to the weird pile of rocks. My brow was covered in sweat, and my hair was messed up where the wind had whipped through it. But all I could think of was finding Jess, and even though I knew the woods were perfectly safe, I cursed myself for having left her alone. I spun around in a circle, scanning for any signs of her, but there were none. Jess! I yelled out loud, my voice traveling through the woods and echoing off the trees. It was getting darker, and tall shadows were being cast all around me like a net. Jess! Where are you? Call out to me, Jess! I stood, and I listened, but there was no reply. I was just about to run further up the creek where the trail began to see if she had started to make her way back home when I saw it. On the other side of the creek, about 50 yards away, it stood. It was as tall as the lowest branches of the sycamore next to it, about 7 feet up. It was covered in black rags, ripped and torn across its thin, wiry body with a hood pulled tightly around its head, obscuring its other features. 2 white, pupilless eyes stared at me from the shadowed recesses, and I spied a flash of teeth. The long, slender arms with hook-like fingers splaying off stumped hands almost dragged against the floor by its side. And I suddenly noticed there was an overpowering smell, and I wondered how I'd missed it. I'd smelt it before on the farms when the cattle were harvested on the slaughterhouses. It was the smell of death. I almost choked, but my mouth wouldn't make a sound. I just kept staring at it, petrified, blood running cold through my veins. Even the birds had stopped yelling in protest, and now there was nothing but silence. It and I. locked in a gaze that I would remember until the day that I died. I don't know how long I was staring like that. It felt like minutes, but it was probably only a few seconds. Suddenly, it shifts its weight and hunches down. And for a brief second, I thought that it was going to start running at me, and I almost threw up, uncontrollable fear racking my body. But then I noticed that it had stooped down to collect something from the ground. I cried out silently. It was Jess. Her limp body looking like a doll compared to its freakishly proportioned frame. Despite being a thin and stick-like, it picked her up in one bony hand with ease, fingers clasped around her waist, teeth bared in a crooked, humorless smile. It opened up part of its shawl and pulled her up close against its blackened torso. I caught a glimpse of a ribcage and rotten flesh. I reached out my arm as if somehow I could pull her back to me, but it was too late. It had turned and started to stride off deeper into the forest. Even if I had known the area of the woods and had the strength to move my legs, I would have never been able to catch up to it. And before I even knew it, it had disappeared from sight. Like it had never been there at all. Only the heavy smell of decay was left lingering in the air, the only evidence that I hadn't just imagined the whole thing. I snapped my head around and began to run back towards town. It was a good mile's distance and I had never run that far before, but that day I ran and I didn't stop, jumping over fallen logs and ducking branches. I dared not look back. The darkness was almost complete by the time that I burst from the undergrowth and into the town's edge. I sprinted to the bar and threw myself into the door, practically collapsing onto the floor. I don't really remember much after that, but from what I was told later on, it took them about 10 minutes to stop me from screaming about a demon that I'd seen in the woods, and that we had to find Jess. By the time they'd actually gotten the story out of me and organized a search party, 2 hours had already passed. Jess's dad shook me and shouted at me, asking me what happened to his baby girl. But I could only stare dumbfounded and mute until my own father dragged him off and told him to get a grip. The sheriff organized the townsfolk into 2 groups, and they each took a different section of the woods. I tried to tell them that they all needed to bring their guns, and that the thing had to be killed. I mean, the thought of going up against such a nightmare unarmed was too much. I begged my father to stay, but he told me to calm down, that I was talking nonsense, and that I was probably just in shock. My mind was making up stories to deal with what had happened. He sent me home to rest under the watchful eye of my mother as he led on one of the groups into the woods. And then 3 hours passed. I was laying in bed, unable to sleep, huddled in my blankets, paranoid of every shadow and creak, convinced that the nightmare, was going to come back for me, the only witness to its abomination. When I heard the front door open and the heavy steps of men entering the living room downstairs, I listened as they sat down and began to talk.
Damnedest thing I'd ever seen in my life, Jerry. I don't know what's out there, but it sure riled up the dogs.
That was the sheriff speaking.
What was it? A bear, you think, Sheriff?
I didn't know the speaker, but he sounded young, maybe one of the farmhands.
Maybe. All I know is that 2 of my best tracker hounds caught a scent and started going mad. They tore off into the woods faster than I'd ever seen them run, and then they didn't come back. Now we're 2 dogs and a little girl down. Jesus H.
Then the voice of my dad. I eased up a little, knowing that he was back in the house. It made me feel safer.
Christ. Chris said that he found the poor girl's gloves down by the creek, right where my boys said that they were playing.
The unknown voice came again, obviously Chris.
It's true. They were covered in some sort of slime or something. I don't know what, but it smelled god-awful, and one of the boys almost upped his liquor. Okay, well, at least we know she was there. I'm not hoping for much, but I'll pray. It's one big forest, and the chances of finding her might be slim.
The sheriff sighed.
I suppose I better go tell the family that they should be prepared for the possibility that they'll never see Jess again. Fuck. No man should have to outlive his kid. And not knowing like this. Didn't Travis say that he saw something big moving through the forest? Another unknown voice. This one was new. Yeah. He radioed in. Said he saw some kind of shit, I don't know, giant moving in the distance. But the man was half pissed and it's dark as the bottom of a whale out there. Probably just jumping at shadows. Or, most likely, a bear or a wolf. Or something jumped her from behind and dragged her off. The sheriff said again. My father spoke, voice raised so everyone could hear. Okay, let's all go home. It's been a tough night. We'll search again for her tomorrow. Even if it's only a body that we find, it's better than the poor folks not knowing what happened. I want everyone to tell their kids not to go into the forest no more until we know for certain what occurred. Understood? There were mumbles of agreements and then solemn goodbyes. The men left and the front door was locked shut behind them. My father moved about downstairs for a few minutes before climbing the stairs and going to bed. Before he turned in, he poked his head into my room to check if I was okay, and I just pretended to be asleep. I had nothing to say. I mean, I didn't even know what to tell myself. But one thing that I knew for certain was that I hadn't been hallucinating. I'd really seen it. Whatever it was. It had Jess. I waited half an hour after I heard my dad climb into his bed before I sat up and switched on my bedside light. I crept out of my bed and got dressed as quietly as I could, and then I descended the stairs. My father had taught me how to shoot and maintain a gun a few years back, and here out in the country it was important to know. Hunting was a tradition amongst the men, and when I was old enough, my father would take me camping in the woods for a weekend for game shooting like his father before him. I knew where my dad kept his .44 Magnum and rounds in the garage, and after searching around for a few minutes, I found the key to the lockbox. I opened it up, loaded the pistol, and grabbed a flashlight before leaving my house and locking the door behind me. My breath misted in the air as the unseasonably cold chill hung around me. I looked at the forest. It was once a place of fun and laughter, but now it was dark and sinister in the moonlight, branches stretching and contorting towards the sky like skeletal fingers. That thing had Jess, and I couldn't live with myself if I didn't do a damn thing to get her back. After all, it was my fault for leaving her alone out there. I swallowed back the lump in my throat and began tenaciously walking down the road towards the woods. Don't worry, Jess, I thought. I'm coming. As I entered the woods, I immediately began to question my actions. I knew that what I was doing was not smart by any stretch of the imagination, that my foolhardiness could very well get me killed. The thought of bumping into the creature out here, alone in the dark, was more terrifying than anything that I could ever imagine. And knowing that Jess was in that very same situation herself was the only thing that drove me on. I trudged onto the familiar old trail about 20 minutes or so, until I eventually came onto the creek. I'd never been out here before in the dark, and although everything out here was as it should be, it looked different. It was as if these woods where I played at during the day were mine, but now in the dark, it was an alien place. This was its domain. I was a stranger here, unwelcome. This feeling was reinforced by the fact that I had no idea what lay beyond the creek, except from what I'd seen in the immediate area from the other side. Carefully, I crossed the creek. The water soaked through my boots, dampening my trouser legs. And as soon as I stepped out onto the other side, I felt like I was lost. How could I find my way back? Which direction would I go in? I ignored the first question. I had bigger things to worry about at the moment, and I decided to head off in the direction that I'd last seen the creature going. I started walking, vigilant for any signs of movement or noise. I'd expected there to be animals out this late at night, but eerily it was silent, which made me feel vulnerable. Every footstep sounded like an alarm, telling the creature where I was.
I stopped for a moment and looked around with my flashlight. I felt like the darkness was swallowing me, and that this thing was just sitting outside of the borders of light, laughing at my efforts to find it. I realized that if there was anything out there, the light would only serve to give away my position, effectively ending any kind of advantage that I would have over it. After a pause, I switched off the flashlight and waited for my eyes to adjust. It was difficult at first, but after a few minutes, I could actually make out enough of the forest to start slowly making my way through. It was about 10 minutes later when I heard it. A short, sharp yelp, and to my left in the distance. I paused and waited to see if any other noise was made. A moment later, snap echoed through the darkness, and a dull thump. I was not alone anymore. Swallowing in fear, I sunk to my haunches and slowly made my way towards the noise. I had plenty of experience at being quiet from the rabbit game, and even in the dark, I didn't find it too hard to distribute my weight as I moved almost silently. After a while, I reached a clearing where the trees parted to a grassy patch of about half the size of a football field. In the center of the clearing was a rocky depression that sunk down into the earth. I was about to make my way over and investigate when I saw it. It was standing near the edge of the clearing to the south. It was slowly limping its way over to the depression, dragging something behind it. In the dark, I couldn't make out what it was, but it was about the size of a child, except if the child had been snapped in the middle. It flapped limply with every bounce like a paper fan. I swallowed a lump and tears stung my eyes. I wasn't sure if I was more scared or sad. I prayed to God to not let it be Jess, and I continued to watch as it reached the pit and then hurled the object over the rim. It hit the ground with the unmistakable sound of crunching bone, and then the creature bent down headfirst as if to crawl down the rocks, and then it stopped. Slowly it stood back up and sniffed, and I instinctively pressed my back to a tree, removing myself from view and strained to listen. I heard it sniff again, softly, and it walked around in what sounded like a small circle, and then nothing. I waited for what seemed like an eternity. I waited. I was unbearably tense, expecting to see its milky eyes slowly peer around the side of the tree, followed by that big, crooked smile at any second, or a long, hooked finger to slide out from under the darkness and rest itself on my shoulder. But nothing. Nothing happened. Nothing continued to happen for the next couple of minutes. Gathering my courage, I hesitantly glanced around the trunk, only to see the clearing was empty. I doubled, tripled, and quadruple checked the area, making deadly sure that it was gone. Then I stepped back out into the clearing edge, making sure to keep low to the ground. To step out into the clearing was out of the question. Suicidal. I mean, what if it was only hiding at the clearing's edge itself, or waiting in the rocky fissure at the center? It would defy all logic, rebel against every survival instinct, and yet I had to know. I'd come here looking for Jess. If I turned back now without checking to see if it was her, crumbled and contorted at the bottom of those rocks, and I may never know. The sheriff was right. The not knowing was the worst part. Before I stepped out, I pulled the magnum from my waistband and cocked the hammer back, being careful to mute the click by smothering it between my legs. When it was loaded and ready to fire, I began slowly to inch my way out of the safety of the tree line and into the open. I took a few steps and stopped, waiting to see if anything would come crashing towards me. But when nothing did, I continued my cautious journey to the depression. When I reached the lip, I aimed the gun ahead of me and I looked over. It was a couple of feet deep, about 10 or so, and was a little larger than I had expected. One side of the hole was hollow and extended into the ground as some sort of cave, large enough to drive a car through. At the mouth of the cave was the body, slumped over a jagged rock. I glanced around again, making sure I wasn't being snuck up on, and then I started to lower myself down. I would just need a quick glance to make sure that it was, or wasn't Jess, and then I'd leave, run back to Fenter. I'd wake up my dad and the others, lead them here, and we'd kill it, in this cave that was surely its dwelling. It could be in there right now, watching me struggle down to the smooth rock, but I reasoned that if it was in the cave, then there was nothing that I could even do about it. I must be crazy. Fear has completely consumed my brain so completely that I must not be able to feel anything anymore, I thought. But this was proven wrong when I slipped and fell off the side of the rock, landing awkwardly and sending pain shooting through my ankle. I almost cursed aloud, but bit down on my lip and shouted silently in my head. Luckily, it wasn't twisted, just achy, and I was able to walk on it without really too much of a problem. The last thing that I needed now was a broken foot. My thoughts were so preoccupied with the sudden pain that I had forgotten that I was now right next to the cavalier. My leg bumped against it and I spun around, gun at the ready, almost firing off into the rocks. I quickly berated myself for being so trigger itchy, but then I looked down. Relief and repulsion flooded through me. From this close, I could see that it wasn't Jess. Oh, it wasn't even human. Instead, I realized that it was a large dog, one of the sheriff's hounds that had gone missing earlier that day. Its back was snapped in two and it was folded upon itself, and its snout was crumpled back into its face, turning it into a flat, tooth-filled gap. Blood, fur, bone, and brain were splattered over it. One eye hung loosely out of the socket. The eye was positioned in such a way that it appeared to be staring right at me. I looked away and I felt bile rising in my throat. The smell of death and decay was overpowering this close, and I dreaded to think what other corpses were nestled away inside. I was about to scramble back up to the edge of the depression when I heard a sob. I spun around and stared into the darkness of the cave. It sounded faint, as if it had come from quite a ways away, echoing throughout the narrow rock passages until eventually finding its way to the surface. It came again. This time, it was unmistakable. It was the sound of a child crying. The first thoughts to rush through my head were that of joy. I mean, she was alive, and it must be Jess, hidden away deep in this creature's lair somewhere. But as soon as those thoughts had come, I had realized that, with a fear unlike any that I'd ever thought possible to feel, that I would have to go deep into that cave to get her. I mean, I didn't really have a choice in the matter. I couldn't just turn back now. I may as well kill myself with the gun that I held in my shaking hand and live with the guilt. I pulled out a flashlight, readying the gun, and I switched it on. The beam stung my eyes for a few seconds as they adjusted to the sudden light, but I could see that the cave went on for a few meters before widening into a kind of large and rocky chamber that had passages from varying sizes, detouring off further underground. I entered the mouth of the cave and shone the beam over the walls of the floor. The beam danced over bones scattered across the ground. It looked as if every type of animal in the forest had eventually wound up in here, torn apart and stripped of flesh. I covered my mouth and my nose with the sleeve of my gun hand, and I continued to walk. There were 4 passages, and the sobbing appeared to be coming from the furthest one to the left. Thankfully, it was one of the wider ones, and I found that I could comfortably walk down and still have enough room to stand up straight. If the creature were to come now from the mouth of the cave, I would be trapped. However, if it was already in the cave, then I was walking straight into its spinely, disproportionate arms. I swallowed hard and I continued to walk. After a couple of meters, I turned right sharply, and it opened up to a smaller version of the chamber that I had just come from. I was amazed to find that it was full of items. Watches, jewelry, passports, letters, glasses, clothes, books, wallets. It went on. It was as if it was a museum to sentimentality and trinkets. I picked up one of the passports and opened it up. Paul Ashcroft, born 1972, Herronford, Ohio. Another one read Richard Blunt, born 1954, Westville, California. I shone the light over the letters, seeing the addresses were places to all over the country, and then it dawned on me. I finally understood.
It all made sense. The reason why I had never seen this thing in the woods before was because it had only just arrived a short time back. It must have traveled from place to place, from forest to national park to desert to mountain, picking people off, taking their effects, and then moving on to the next town. It was like a sick scavenger hunt. It was killing people and then keeping their items like souvenirs. Another sob brought me back to reality, and I dropped the passports to the ground. I hurriedly walked to the back of the chamber that I now called the museum, and found another sort of passage, and then a medium-sized cavern. Inside was Jess, sitting on the floor and crying. She looked up when my light shone over her and covered her eyes. Please, let me go. She burst out into fresh sobs, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. I stood paralyzed for a second. I was so intent on finding her that now that I really didn't know what to do. I decided that it was best to let her know that it was me before deciding on anything. I shone the light upwards, illuminating my face, and Jess stopped sobbing and just stared. Jess, I've come to rescue you. We don't have much time. We need to go now before that thing comes back here to find me here, I whispered, kneeling beside her. She really didn't do anything for a few moments, and then she threw her arms around me, her body shaking. I thought I was going to die down here. I thought it was just going to eat me like it did the rest. I don't... It's... She trailed off, unable to get the words out through the tears. I squeezed her back for a moment, and then I went to lift her. The sound of metal clanging against rock reverberated throughout the cave. I shone the light down, and my heart sunk. She was chained to a heavy metal ring pin that had been nailed deep into the rocks beside her. I couldn't escape, she sniffled. I tried to pull it out, but it's no use. I stood for a second, defeat rushing over me. I could get help and then come back and... No, she squeaked. Please, don't leave me here. Panic spread across her face, and it was all that I could do to promise not to leave. I thought for a few moments, and then I realized my only option. I took her chin and I looked her in the eye. Jess, I have a gun. I'm gonna have to shoot the chain to set you free. It's going to be very loud, and the noise will almost assuredly attract that thing here. She said nothing and just continued to look at me. As soon as it's broken, we are going to have to run for the cave entrance and back through the woods. She looked thoughtfully for a moment to herself, and then she took my chin, and she kissed me, and then nodded. I blushed. Sitting below ground in a monster cave, and I was blushing. I almost laughed. I forced the emotion down, and I just smiled before taking my gun and aiming it at the chain. Alright. Cover your eyes. I'll do it on 3, okay? 1, 2... A guttural moan sounded from the mouth of the cave, and it carried its way to us. I saw the color drain from Jess's face, and I knew mine was doing the same. It was back. Without thinking, I pulled the trigger, and the gun cracked, deafening in such a small space. But the chain shattered, and I grabbed Jess before she could react. I pulled her up, and we were sprinting towards the museum. As we entered in, I dived behind the table, pulling her down with me. And no sooner had we landed on the floor than I saw the creature enter into the room and scramble over the passage that we had just exited from. And as soon as it was gone from sight, I pulled her back up and I pushed her towards the passage that led towards the cave mouth. She didn't need to be told twice, and we ran as fast as our legs could carry us. As the cave mouth came into view, a scream full of horror and anger rang out from behind us as it discovered its meal had been stolen. As we got into the cave mouth, I could hear the wood splintering and the tinkle of dozens of tiny objects hit the stone as it tore through the museum after us. I grabbed Jess's foot and I hoisted her up till she grabbed the lift of the depression and pulled herself up into the clearing. I spun around to saw it exiting the passage into the chamber. Its hood had fallen down and it was exposed. What could only be described as a half-insect, half-human face. I fired a shot off in its direction and it screeched in agony as the .44 bullet connected with its thigh, knocking it back on for a second.
I took the distraction and spun around, leaping for the ledge of the depression and grabbing a hold. Jess seized me by the collar and helped me up by pulling me, and I felt the hooks of the fingers brush against the bottom of my shoe. We started to run across the clearing. The sun was coming up now, and the sky was a pinky red, casting a slight glow on, well, everything. We ran and we ran and we ran and ran and ran. The whole while, I could just hear it crashing through the trees after us. If I hadn't hit one of its thighs, I don't think we would even stand a chance of outrunning it. But somewhere, some god was watching over us. It was about 45 minutes before we reached the creek, and by the time that we saw the edge of the woods, an hour had passed. I still, to this day, do not know how we managed to run so fast and so far without stopping, but I do remember that the adrenaline was coursing through me so violently that I shook for hours afterwards. When we reached Fenter, I fired the gun off into the air, and within 2 minutes, dumbstruck townspeople surrounded us. Some people were asking what had happened, and others were grabbing and hugging Jess, while most were just staring blankly. When Jess's father arrived, he broke down and cried, holding his girl to his chest and thanking God, and me equally, for his daughter's safe return. When my father arrived, he took the gun from me. He put his hands on my shoulder and he gave me a look. It was a look that said he didn't care what happened, just that he was glad that I was safe. Regardless, we had to explain to the sheriff what had happened, and after we both explained our stories, a group was organized and armed, and I was asked to lead by my dad. I was tired and very reluctant to go back, but next to my dad, I felt safe. So after a couple of hours, we came across the clearing, and we found the cave system just as we had described. But the museum was empty. The shattered chain was found at the back untouched, and a brief examination of the other caves revealed them to contain skeletons of other people later identified as missing persons from the towns that backed off of Fenter Woods. A medical check showed that they had been dead for a few days now. The woods were searched all day, but nothing was turned up. That night, as I looked out my window before going to sleep, I saw it again. Standing at the edge of the woods, it looked at me through my window for a while, but I stared back, like when we had first encountered one another, and then it turned and walked back into the woods. I knew that this would be the last time that I would ever see it. It was moving on to another place, away from Fenter, from this entire area. The woods were searched for another week, but nothing was ever found. The official report stated that people had been kidnapped and killed by a maniac who had escaped and into the wilderness before he could be apprehended, although the people of Fenter never really questioned our version of the story. So, that's it for my account. This all happened about 12 years ago, and it is but a distant memory at this point. Jess has just about finished university and is going on to become a lawyer for animal rights, and I'm working on the family farm after dropping out of college. I'll tell you this story, not really to entertain you, but as a warning. Because the next time that you decide to go out hiking in the mountains or camping in the woods, just know that it is still out there. And next time, it might be your town that it decides to visit. So be safe. Thanks for the story. But that's all, I guess. Enjoy your night.